Many current DC residents who did not grow up in the DMV lack even a general knowledge of DC's history. The glamour of national monuments and politics often overlooks the deeply rich history of the district. As people take to the streets around the country to fight racial injustice, it is important to look back into the history of our own communities to better understand how exactly we got to where we are today. I will be using this platform to educate anyone who's willing to listen on DC's past and how it still impacts the present. In 1790, the national order changed as DC was declared the new capital of the United States. Only 2 years later, in 1792, began the construction of the first White House, with the help of many slaves. It is also important to note that many historic monuments were built by slaves. Slaves created the city, yet that side of history is often left undiscovered by new residents and those who come and go in the political world. In 1862, slaves were officially freed from the district. That was around 9 months before the rest of the country. In 1867, 375 acres of land in Anacostia, known as Berry Farm, was purchased for the settlement of now freed Black Americans. A large portion of the land was non-arable and deemed undesirable. Decades later, the government used a portion of this land for segregated lower-income housing, calling it Berry Farm. Less than 100 years after that, due to the city's obvious neglect and lack of commitment to the community, Berry Farm closed its doors, dispersing the community into other neighborhoods in DC. This is just one of many examples of displacement of Black DC residents. Between 1913 and 1921, President Woodrow Wilson was in office. President Wilson, despite calling for justice for Black Americans during his campaigns, pursued regressive policies. Wilson was also president during World War I. He mandated a segregated army as well as segregation in federal agencies. Wilson's policies proved to be a massive step backwards for the civil rights movement.
In 1936, the DC chapter of the National Negro Congress organized a campaign against police brutality and segregation.
So no, police brutality is not a 21st century phenomenon. In the case of Heard v. Hodge, the Supreme Court declared racially restrictive housing covenants as unconstitutional.
Segregation ended in D.C. in 1953 via the District of Columbia v. John R. Thompson Co., when the NAACP charter member and activist Mary Church Terrell was refused service from Thompson's cafeteria based off her race. This was only a few blocks from the White House on 14th Street in Northwest.
Between the 1950s and the 1970s, white flight was high. 60% of DC's white population fled for the suburbs due to more affordable housing opportunities as well as a resistance to racial integration in public. These affordable housing opportunities for white families were often not available for Black families in the suburbs. In 1960, Black residents were prohibited from living in certain neighborhoods. During this time, over 12% of Black homes in DC lacked running water and over 16% lacked electricity. Authors of the book Chocolate City wrote that this neglect was not only due to the effects of slavery, but especially due to an intentional underinvestment in Black communities. The book also noted that in DC, industrial sites, landfills, toxic waste sites, and others were strategically placed in Black neighborhoods. This not only harmed the residents physically, but it also made the areas increasingly undesirable destinations to live in, and it prompted even more racial stigma. 1963 was a huge year for the civil rights movement. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom occurred this year, as well as the tragic murder of Martin Luther King Jr.
Segregation still plagued each neighborhood, showing massive racial divisions. That year, the population of Black residents was 71%. But now, in 2020, it does not even break 50.
Flash forward to 2000 to 2013. DC was noted to have the highest rate of gentrification in the entire country. Since 2000, the percentage of lower-income populations have dropped significantly or have nearly vanished. Most of these people are lower-income Black households, single mothers, and/or those without a college degree. These neighborhoods have a white population growth of 202% and a decline in the Black population growth, a 2019 report finds. It is truly quite shocking to see such a devastating lack of investment in a population just a mile from the capital. Few policies aim to strategically enhance the living conditions of lower income families in the long run. Even fewer have been effective. 2008, the financial crisis. Leading up to this, mortgage lenders and predatory banks approved Black residents in DC and all around the country for subprime loans, leaving the population with extremely high interest rates. With Black households having a larger share of wealth and home ownership in DC, the population was disproportionately affected afterwards. In 2018, new data was released that Black DC residents were not benefiting nearly as much from DC's strong economy as was expected. While the median income for white households increased over the decade very strongly, the Black median household income had barely seen any growth. So what does this mean? It means that DC is not doing enough to remove the barriers to economic opportunities, such as hiring discrimination, underfunded schools, and insufficient and affordable housing. Flash forward to May 2020. George Floyd is murdered by a cop. Protests and riots began in response to his death, along with many other victims of police brutality and racial injustice. In June 2020, just a few blocks from the White House, a 2-block stretch on 16th Street Northwest was renamed the Black Lives Matter Plaza. While there are so many other important moments in history during this time, it shows that people's voices cannot be silenced. The Black Lives Matter Plaza is a monument in itself, showing the never-ending efforts of activists. On Juneteenth, 2020, protesters tore down Confederate statues around the country, including DC. In DC, demonstrators pulled down the statue of Albert Pike, a former Confederate soldier and commander. Now we'll take a look at DC's demographic stats for the Black and white majority population. While the population only differs by a few percentage points, the difference between the median household income by race shows disturbing discrepancies. A $95,803 difference. That can be 1, 2, 3, 4 years of college paid for. Now, consider the previously mentioned historical points in DC and how this could have contributed to this specific difference. If you want to learn more about these disparities, look into DC Fiscal Policy Institute or research the history of DC's racial equity policies. Which public schools face the most budget cuts in 2020? 17 out of the 20 schools that face these significant budget cuts were located in Ward 7 and 8, which each have a Black population of 92%. So you may be asking, then what is the white population in Ward 7 and 8? Collectively, it's 7%. Sounds pretty disproportionate, doesn't it? You may ask, what is next for DC? And that is an answer that none of us have. But you, me, each of us have the opportunity to help decide what DC's future is. There are many things you can do in your daily life to help raise awareness in racial equity. Aside from being an awesome activist and signing petitions, starting them, calling representatives, etc., there's a lot more you can do. Instead of going to George Washington's Mount Vernon estate that housed many slaves, visit the house of Frederick Douglass, one of the famous abolitionists. His house is located in southeast DC. Also, think twice as you pass a new residential or restaurant establishment. Perhaps a family or a local business owner was forced out of their home or business due to an increase in property taxes or income taxes that were unrealistic to afford, just to make way for economic growth. The reality is, we are pushing out the Black majority in DC. Many of these people who have been here for centuries, or who migrated to DC to be a part of its unique culture, or who were simply seeking employment opportunities and so much more. But when people speak of gentrification, they often claim that they're investing in the neighborhoods. But what they ignore is the fact that they're investing in the physical location, but not the people. Black neighborhoods have historically lacked investment because they weren't considered quote unquote safe investments. We need to do better, and we need to do better now. Arm yourself with determination and continue to urge others to join the fight. We are in this together.